Vampires, zombies, werewolves, these are all things that are in our pop culture. They're in our psyches to some degree. These are characters, mostly fictional characters that we think about, that are in our world, that we like to tell stories about. But anytime I see something where there is a lot of popular attention about something, I always wonder what psychologically is underneath that. What is motivating us psychologically to like stories about vampires and werewolves and, as of late, zombies, right? Zombies have been really popular. And so that got me interested in this topic. I started to think about it. And then as I thought about it and started to research it, I found that there are actually a lot of people out there who take this stuff really, really, really seriously. Like to the point where they believe that they are a vampire, or they believe they have vampiristic urges or drives to drink blood, these kind of things. And the same is true for werewolves, and to some degree for zombies. And so this really got me interested. Now, who the hell thinks that they're a vampire? What do they do? What kinds of vampires are there? Is this just a pop culture thing? Too many people watching Twilight? Too many people reading Anne Rice's books about vampires, which, by the way, are very good. And I'll confess here that I used to have a job when I was a university administrator. And part of that job is I had to fly around to different places. I had to go to Sacramento and go, lobby the state, whatever boards and do stuff. And I'd fly around a lot. And I spent times in airports. And I discovered some of the best airport reading was Anne Rice. And I started reading, Diary of a Vampire. And I got kind of hooked into it. And I think I read, by the time I left that job, I had read most of Anne Rice's, at least her major works. Some of which I still believe are just absolutely phenomenal pieces of writing. I think some of them are just incredible. And she paints a whole world, and she actually, at some of them, she creates a whole theology, and vampires are part of that, where humans and vampires are part of that world. But then she introduces other things like devils and angels, and it gets really interesting and complicated. And then she became a born-again Christian and stopped writing about this stuff. And the last I heard is that she no longer is at least so fervent. And I think she's back to writing again. Somebody said that. She's writing new stuff anyway. But for a very well worked out vampire world, I really recommend her stuff. But she has just one vision of vampires, and we have lots of other ones out there. Hers, for a while in the early 2000s, 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, was really the predominant view of vampires. Just like nowadays, the predominant view of zombies comes from, Walking Dead. So if anybody asks what's a zombie like, you immediately think to Walking Dead and those kind of zombies, right? But what's gone on is, in the past, there have been really widely, somewhat divergent views of these mythical creatures and people's relationship to those things. Okay, zombies have really changed quite a bit. Vampires have changed quite a bit. And there's different views of vampires from all around the world, there's a lot of similarity, and then there's a lot of, or at least there's some differences. And I'll talk to you a few about those, and where some of these vampire myths came from, and some of where the vampire stories came from. And you can also then see from the earlier stories of vampires where various writers got their inspirations from, including Anne Rice. And I'll point out some Anne Rice stuff here. My favorite Anne Rice movie, by the way, vampire movie, is Queen of the Damned. Anybody seen that? Started that young woman, Aaliyah. What was her name? It was very unfortunate. She got killed. She was a singer. She got killed in a plane accident. It was very unfortunate. It was very talented. I thought she just did a tremendous job in that film. And that's one of my favorite ones, and that's based not exactly, but loosely on the Anne Rice sort of universe of vampires. So I recommend that one if you want to watch a good movie. I think it's on Netflix. Okay, so we're going to talk about vampires, and we're hopefully going to get to werewolves at the end. And then I'll either mention zombies along the way, or if we have time, I'll go into zombies a little more. And I love this poster. This is from a movie from the 70s. The 60s and 70s were actually a time when there were a lot of vampire movies out made. Some of them were made by Hammer Films, which was a British company, and they did a lot of these vampire films. And a lot of them starred people like Christopher Lee. You guys know who he was? He died recently. He was the guy, he played Count Dooku on, no, he was one of the bad guys on. Was he Count Dooku?
On Star Wars.
Yeah, on Star Wars. That's how most people know him from. But in the 60s and 70s, he played a lot of these vampire, in a lot of these vampire movies. Excellent. And the other guy who played in him across from who you would know, oh, I'm blanking on his name. That'll come to me. Anyway. So you can see posters like this, things that happen and never seen by human beings. The blood flows like vintage wine, you know, and these are kind of exploitational films. And so there's a number of these done. That was sort of the heyday of these. And then when you got into the 80s and 90s, and then things became a little more sophisticated, vampires started to change a bit, right? And so, of course, and then, you know, you got into more really recent things like Twilight, and vampires have changed quite a bit, right? Twilight, the vampires are really beautiful and sexy. So what's happened is the vampire image has always had a sort of a healthy dose of narcissism in it, but what's happened is in our narcissistic universe, we project our narcissistic needs onto the vampires, and now we have beautiful vampires, right? Beautiful narcissistic vampires. They're lovely. Is where the original vampires, like Nosferatu, were incredibly ugly, and they were monster-like and really quite frightening. And, you know, they stunk like dead people, and they looked hideous. And now you have, you know, beautiful Twilight vampires. So again, I think that says something about us as a society and what we project our needs onto, and that we're a lot more maybe narcissistic now as a society. That's my little psychological analysis. Maybe that's right, maybe it isn't. So this is Nosferatu from the original film, which was done. It was a silent film, and this was Dracula. This was the character, and extremely hideous, frightening character. Have you guys seen the original Nosferatu film? You guys seen that? I highly recommend seeing it. It's really interesting and tells you a lot about filmmaking, but also about these early vampire stories, the depictions of vampires, right? And Nosferatu was roughly, actually pretty solidly based on the work by Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker was a British theater guy, and he wrote, you know, maybe the definitive work on vampires. You know, one of the definitive works on vampires in the Western world. And Bram Stoker's Dracula was a really interesting book, and he drew from lots of myths about vampires, and he put them together in this book. And then this is the first thing they made the film out of, was this thing. I might have a clip of it. I don't know. So this is Nosferatu, 1922. You can see a few minutes of it here. This is the young man who gets called to Dracula's castle to sign some papers. Dracula's going to migrate to London. And so this guy's setting up all the paperwork, and while he's there, he gets basically vampirized, turned into like a servant vampire. Now I saw this film in Chicago, and they had a modern classical group, the Kronos Quartet. If you ever heard of them, if you like classical music, they played to this live music by Philip Glass, which is very hypnotic, and it was very interesting. And so sometimes you can see this, and I've also seen it live out here at Los Olivos. They had people playing live. They had a keyboardist and played live like music background to this. It was really cool. So this is the basic thing. And here's going to here. See, here he is rising up from the grave, and you know, or the guy finds the grave here, but he can't. There's Nosferatu in there, right? Hideous vampire. Etc. Okay. When I was a kid, there was another TV series that you guys are way too young to know about. It was called Dark Shadows. This played in the 60s. And when I was a little kid, I was a kid. I was like probably, I was 8, 9, 10 years old when it was on the air, and it was kind of a vampire soap opera. It was like the prequel to Twilight and all those kind of things. It was a vampire soap opera that played on daytime TV, just like a regular kind of soap opera, except they had vampires. And near the end of it, near the end of the series, it started getting into really wild stuff like time travel and all sorts of weird things. And when I was a kid, I watched this religiously, as did all my other friends, and we watched Dark Shadows, and the main character was Barnabas, and Barnabas was this vampire who was, again, kind of evil and sadistic and a little bit hideous, but also starting to become seductive and a little bit sexy. And so he was sort of, I think of Barnabas as sort of the bridge between the worlds, right? Barnabas starting to be, the bridge to the more modern vampires. And Barnabas was mostly evil in the beginning, and then he becomes kind of more good near the end, and then he becomes kind of good, and you kind of like him. He's an anti-hero. People kind of like him. And I mention that because if you have Hulu, you can watch all the Dark Shadows, all the episodes are up, or whatever ones they have left, because I think they lost some of them. They're up there, and that's an interesting thing to watch. I had surgery a couple years ago, and I was recovering, and so I just binge-watched all of them again. I didn't quite finish. Then they put more up, and so I'm still trying to get through all the rest of them. But now I'm into the weird stuff with all the time travel and things like that. You can tell when the TV show jumps the shark, right? If they have time travel, weird stuff in it. But also another good one I'd recommend if you have time. Okay, well, let's take a detour before we talk about human beings. Let's talk about animal kingdom, because I think if I asked most of you right now, do real vampires actually exist? There are real vampires out there. Most of you are going to go, no. I mean, there might be people who think they're vampires, but real vampires who drink blood and are immortal, they've died and come back and they drink blood and they're immortal, you're going to tell me, no. Right? I think most of you. I hope most of you. Maybe not. But the truth of the matter is, vampirism exists in the animal kingdom. Now, not the coming back from the dead part. That does not exist. Once you die, you pretty much die. It doesn't matter whether you're a human being or an animal or a bug or whatever. Once you die, that's pretty much it. You don't generally come back. And by the way, I'll mention that in our conception of vampirism, there is a healthy dose of zombieism as well. And zombies and vampires are highly related, right? Because zombies are also beings who die and then come back from the dead. And vampires, to become a vampire, you get bitten, you die. Generally, in most depictions, you die, and then it could be quickly or slowly, but then you come back as a vampire. Now, in the vampire literature mostly requires, a lot of times, repeated bitings. You don't just die right away. You got to get repeatedly bitten, and then eventually you fade out, and then you come back as a vampire. That's the pretty typical thing. And a lot of that comes out of Bram Stoker, right? So there's a healthy dose of vampirism and zombieism and vampirism. And the best movie, actually, to see this sort of dual vampire-zombie is called Last Man on Earth. And you guys may know that from the Will Smith depiction of that, which was called, I'm blanking on it. Now, Will Smith did a version of that. I Am Legend, yes, I Am Legend, which is a pretty good movie. They pretty good they did it pretty good. But there was one before that was done in the 70s starring Charlton Heston called Last Man on Earth. And that in and of itself was a remake of a film done in the 60s starring Vincent Price called Last Man on Earth. Now, I think if you watch the original, it's in black and white. You're going to think it's really quite quaint, compared to the stuff nowadays that you see on film screens that scare the crap out of you. When I was a kid, that movie scared the crap out of me. I watched that. I was just frightened. I thought, it was going to be the end of the earth and the apocalypse. Now I look back and I go, oh, how quaint, We have so much worse zombies and vampires now, It's like nothing even close to like a Walking Dead episode, right? But the vampires, the zombies in those films they have vampire characteristics. They drink blood. They sleep during the day. They don't go out during the day. They only come out at night. And so it's a really interesting blending of the two genres, vampires and zombies. So I recommend any of the films. Actually, all three of them are pretty good. I recommend watching. Charlton Heston is kind of a ham actor. You guys know who he is, right? Yeah, he's kind of a ham actor, but it's a pretty good film. Not quite as good as Soylent Green, and not quite as good as Planet of the Apes. But it's in there. It's in there. Those are three big horror or science fiction movies he did in the 70s, which, it's what people know him from, right? Soylent Green, it's people, right? you damn dirty apes, right? We all know these things, right? So, but last man on earth, I reckon. So, we don't. So vampires and zombies are similar, except that in real life, people don't come back from the dead. At least not yet. Nobody's engineered a zombie virus to make that happen. Who knows? Hope springs eternal. But what we do have in the real world is we do have creatures that survive by drinking blood, or in the case of spiders, liquefying the insides of their victims and then sucking them out through a proboscis, a long straw that they insert into the body. And ticks and things like this, which are very vampire-like. And so the main vampire creatures that actually exist in the earth are mosquitoes, right? We all know mosquitoes. Mosquitoes, talk about real vampires, I mean, even if you had zombies and vampires, they kill just a few people, right? Suck a little blood and then go into the shadows. Mosquitoes have killed millions and millions of people, right? Mosquito-borne diseases are really serious. Okay? And unfortunately, mosquito-borne diseases are still a huge problem for human beings, right? And you may not believe in climate change, but one of the ways that you can convince climate change deniers that climate really is, on average, getting warmer is that you can look and see the ranges of mosquitoes. Like you have mosquitoes, for instance, that live in Mexico, and now, a few years ago they were confined to Mexico, and now we're finding those same mosquitoes in the southern United States. As the average temperature gets to where they like it, they migrate along with the temperature and come up in the United States. And this is where we get things now like Zika virus, why we have Zika virus in the United States, because the mosquitoes can now survive in the United States because on average it's warmer. And so this is a big part of the problem of climate change, that mosquito-borne diseases migrate along with the climate. As the climate gets warmer, they expand and spread their territory. And so this is a problem. The Zika virus, huge problem. Other diseases are really big problem. Some you may not have heard of, dengue fever, malaria in some parts of the world. So they actually, mosquitoes are a really big issue, and there's all sorts of interesting ways people are dealing with them now. They're using a lot of genetic things. They're genetically reprogramming mosquitoes so they'll be sterile and then releasing them back into the wild, and so the mosquitoes mate with sterile mosquitoes, and then theoretically you have less mosquitoes. In the past, what we did is we just found standing water and just sprayed it with DDT. That's not been such a great thing for the environment. So we're always constantly fighting against mosquito-borne infections. It's always a big issue. Luckily, where we live here in Camarillo, we don't have a big mosquito problem. I think if you go over near like Malibu 120, there's an evaporative cooler in the back, and I think they breed in there, and you get bitten by mosquitoes back there. But that's the only place on campus I've ever really found mosquitoes. We don't have a lot around here. We're really, really very fortunate about that, because you don't have to go very far to find places that are pretty mosquito infested. And they're really annoying. And you guys been to mosquito-infested places? Yeah, it's terrible. We're really blessed here we don't have that. On the other hand, what we do have here are these, number 2, ticks. And there's a big tick there. This is like a big one that you might find in your dog. And again, the ticks live in the grass or the trees, and when you go by in the woods, they sense you, and they jump onto you, and then they latch on, and then they suck blood, and their bodies fill up with blood. And at a certain point, they drop off, and then they lay eggs, and cycle continues. Ticks also are a big source of diseases, and all sorts of diseases come from ticks, tularemia, and of course the one that you know the most, which is actually also still a problem, and its range is also expanding, is Lyme's disease. And Lyme's disease is now becoming really quite an issue. I just read an article the other day that on the East Coast, the range for Lyme's disease ticks now has vastly increased. Lyme's disease is spreading through these ticks much more rapidly than people thought. And the reason for that is because part of the life cycle is the ticks live on mice. And the mice have bred, there's been like a population growth of mice, which happens when woodland areas get sort of carved up. And what happens is you have a woodland area, and somebody builds a housing development over here, and they build a highway over here, and now that area is sort of isolated, and the natural predators of things like mice, which are big, larger animals like coyotes, can't get in to eat the mice there. And then what happens is in those areas, the mice have rapid population growth, and with more mice, you get more ticks, and you get more Lyme disease, and you get more now humans are living next to it, and you get more human interaction. And this is really happening on the East Coast now. This is a big problem on the East Coast. However, we have Lyme disease here. If you go hiking up in the woods here, you can get deer ticks, and the ticks are very small. They're like the size of a sesame seed, little black deer ticks. We also have the same problem here, that there's a lack of predators of mice and deer. A lot of the predators are gone now, and so these animals have, if you notice, a deer have like become incredibly prolific, and so they carry these ticks, and so we now coming into contact with them, and you can get these things. And I had a friend of mine who was hiking up in Ojai with her dogs, and she got Lyme disease just a couple years ago. And you may know people who've had Lyme disease, so it's something that's very prevalent around here. So if you are walking in the woods, by the way, public service announcement, and you think you've been exposed to a place where there'd be Lyme disease, usually if you're on a trail, a well-marked trail, and it's not covered with grass and everything, usually you're pretty good for Lyme disease. It's when you get off the trail that you really get the problem, because they live in the grass and they jump from the grass onto human beings. But if you come home and you take a shower and you do a tick patrol, you'll probably be pretty good. It usually takes the ticks a while to latch onto you, and up to 24 hours before you get sort of infected. Usually it can be shorter, but also can take a long time. So on average, it takes a day or so for you to get infected by the ticks. Yes?
Do ticks typically stay away from bug spray?
I don't know. I mean, I know that for dogs, they get those tick collars and everything, and that's just to drive them off. I don't know if like the bug spray, which has DEET in it, deters the ticks or not. I would not trust it. I would make sure that I check myself. Take a shower afterward. You got somebody who you're close enough to have them give you a check. Look in the places you can't see. But watch out for the ticks, because again, a lot of diseases and stuff. Also, tularemia is another disease. I think the ticks around here carry that as well. It's not as bad as Lyme disease, but also can be pretty debilitating. So ticks are pretty bad. Leeches. You may have seen what leeches are. Luckily, we don't have too many leeches around here, so it's nothing you really need to worry about. Leeches you find in tropical, semi-tropical places, usually in swamps, and these are creatures that latch onto your body, and they then suck the blood out, and when they get their fill, they drop off. And you've seen all these jungle movies where the guy's getting leeches on them, and they're, oh, take it off me, right? But leeches actually, when they attach, they secrete a chemical which numbs the skin, so you don't feel them bite you, because that's a good evolutionary adaptation, because if you feel it biting, you're going to brush it off, right? So it's very stealthy. And so you don't feel it, and then it sucks the blood out, and then it drops off. And that chemical actually is something that people are analyzing as something that can be useful. Leeches were used in medicine for quite a long time, back in the day when they thought bleeding people was important. They used to bleed people up until like the middle 1800s. Common treatment in medicine for a wide variety of illness was to bleed you. They'd make a little cut, and they'd take out some blood, and then that was thought to rectify the humors of the body and to balance you out and make you healthy again. But it was messy, and then some doctor realized, well, if I raise some leeches, this is after the British, were down in India, and they realized where there's leeches, they realized, well, if I raise these leeches and just put leeches on somebody, they're painless. When they're done, I just take them off, I leave them, I have this supply of leeches, and it's painless, and it's no blood everywhere, and that would be a pretty good thing. So he started using leeches in medicine. That was a practice that was pretty common for a while. Bats. Well, we all know about vampire bats. This is part of our, again, part of the popular culture. And we know that Dracula turns into a bat. We know that there are bats that feed on blood in real life. Usually these are found in Latin America, and they're known to go and perch on top of a goat and drink its blood and this kind of thing. They've been known to attack people, but not fatally. We don't have any vampire bats, as far as I know, around here. Spiders. Spiders are not technically blood vampires. What they do is they typically have fangs. They inject their prey with some venom, and then they inject their prey with something that liquefies the insides. And then they stick their proboscis in and, like a straw, suck up that delicious meat milkshake, and then go on their way. So spiders have a sort of vampiristic nature, but it's not just blood. Okay? One of my favorite vampiric creatures. Paracanthropopa vampira. In other words, the vampire fish, also known by its local Amazonian name. It's in the Amazon basin, called the Candiru fish. Candiru fish is a good reason, if you're especially down in the Amazon and you go in a river and you're bathing in the river, it's a good reason not to pee in the water while you're swimming. Because what the Candiru does, it is a vampiristic fish which typically attaches to the gills of other fish. It's very small, and it gets into the gills of other fish. And the gills are where, for fish, right, they're like our lungs. That's where the exchange of oxygen takes place, right? That the fish are able to absorb oxygen from the water through their gills. And so the blood vessels, the capillaries, are very close to the surface. The Candiru slips behind the gill, attaches, drinks the blood, and survives that way. And then when it's done, it drops off and goes and swims around until another fish comes by. The way the Candiru fish finds the gills is because the gills also, in the gills, it also gives out like ammonia. It's like a waste product of the gas exchange. And the other place in water where you find ammonia is, of course, in your pee. And so if you pee in the water, there's ammonia in the pee, and the Candiru fish smells that ammonia, and it swims toward the ammonia. And what it does is it will swim up the course of where the ammonia is coming from, which will be your urethra, whether you're a male or a female, and it will go lodge itself up into the urethra. And there's been many documented cases where guys are swimming in the water, and they're peeing in the water, and the Candiru fish will go up the urethra of the penis. And then what it does to attach itself is it fans out barbs to attach itself there. And you imagine how painful that is. And then you have to go and have it surgically removed. And not a pleasant thing. Let's see, I think I might have a little film for you of the Candiru.
Relieving yourself in the river is not a crime. But thanks to a brutal bloodsucker, it could have painful and dangerous consequences. Manaus, Brazil. An operating room sets the scene for one of the most frightening animal attack stories known to man. Inside this patient, a blood-sucking invader has taken hold. But this isn't your average parasite. Inside this man is a fish, and it's burrowed inside his urethra. Demonstrated here in an aquarium, Candiru normally prey on other larger fish. They search for signs of urea released from a fish's gills. Then, when the fish is in range, they slip inside, latch on with special barbs, and feed. So how did this vampire fish end up in a man's urethra? The answer is simple and terrifying. While enjoying a day bathing in the Amazon River, this man felt an urgent need to empty his bladder. Human urine contains the same urea and ammonia released by fish gills. By relieving himself in the river, he invited instantaneous pain. A Candiru is dining inside his body. Now, after 3 days of agonizing pain, doctors at the Adventist Hospital of Manaus work carefully to end this man's suffering. But it won't be easy. Lodged inside his urethra, the fish has gorged on blood, and spikes on its gills expanded, hooking into the man's urinary tract. It's swollen to almost 1.5 centimeters in width, and to avoid major risks, the Candiru will have to go out the same way it came in. The operation goes on for hours. Finally, the surgeon manages to cut the barb, extracting the unwanted occupant. And what they find is hard to imagine. The Candiru stretches over 15 centimeters long. This surgery was a success, and the patient fully recovered from his ordeal. But it's perfectly clear, if you need to go, don't do it in the Amazon anywhere near these bloodsuckers.
So anyway, there's lots. If you want to go on YouTube, there's a lot more stuff on there. So don't pee in the pool. A pool's okay because it's full of chlorine. but don't pee in the river. And we don't have Candiru around here, so until global warming gets a lot worse, they'll probably stay down in South America. But there's lots of parasites out there, different kinds that feed on others. So that's the animal kingdom. Let's get back to the human world. And dare I say, the human imaginal world, because these vampires really come from myths and stories that human beings have had for quite a long time. We've talked about vampires for a lot of human history, so it seems to be something that we have as kind of an archetypal interest in, right? And also not just vampires, but also the idea about blood being very special. That blood has some special quality to it, some sort of quality of life force with regard to it. Anybody here a Jehovah's Witness? Anybody here follow Jehovah's Witnesses? Anybody Jehovah's Witnesses in the class? I had I was in San Francisco and I was getting a cup of coffee, hanging out at the cool hip coffee shop, and this older gentleman came to me and he had a little tract pamphlet, Jehovah's Witness thing, and he gave it to me. Oh, would you be interested in learning about Jesus and Jehovah's Witness and this kind of stuff? I said, oh yeah, sure, Jehovah's Witness. Like, oh, I'm really interested in you guys. You guys are really interesting. And he goes, why? I go, because you have beliefs that are similar to vampires. And he was a little offended and taken back by that. He goes, well, what do you mean? I go, well, I mean, if you get in a car accident and you go to the hospital and you need a transfusion, you will not allow the blood of other people to be put in your body. I said, is that correct? And he said, yes, that's true. We have this belief about blood. And I said, yes, and it's your belief about blood that's very similar to vampires, because vampires believe that blood has some special spiritual, numinous quality to it, right? That it's not just stuff that, goes around and oxygenates your cells, but it has some spiritual quality to it. And again, this is what the vampire feeds on. And I said, you have that same belief in Jehovah's Witness. And he goes, well, actually, we kind of do. Though they don't believe that you should go out and suck people's blood and all that stuff, but they have the same sort of belief, magical belief about blood being special, having a spiritual quality to it. So again, this is not a belief that is really necessarily restricted to a bunch of goth kids hanging out in the corner or whatever, that you also find this in in some modern religions as well. Right? This idea that blood has something special to it. So one thing we can talk about is we can talk about different types of vampires in sort of the human imaginal realm. The different types of vampires that human beings have imagined or thought of. So here's some basic ones. And these aren't the only ones. We could talk about these. This list could be a starting point for us. So the basic definition that we've already talked about, a reanimated corpse that rises at night to drink the blood of the living. A reanimated corpse that rises at night to drink the blood of the living. So again, we also have echoes of the zombie here. Okay. The second one, psychic vampires, who are individuals who drain others of vital energy. And this is an interesting kind of vampire that, and this can be both conscious and unconscious. Anybody have a friend that, somebody you like, but God, hanging out with them, just you feel drained afterward, right? So that would be somebody who might be unconsciously a psychic vampire. Now this term supposedly was coined by Anton LaVey. Anton LaVey was the founder of the Church of Satan, which was based in San Francisco, and I really should do a whole lecture just on the Church of Satan and Satanism and Anton LaVey, and maybe in future versions of this class I'll do that. It's really quite fascinating, because the Church of Satan is not what you think it is, that they worship this, dark being, Satan, and this kind of stuff. They have the trappings of that, but when they asked Anton LaVey, well, what do you believe in? He goes, oh, I don't believe in any of this stuff. I don't believe in religion or God or anything. So, well, why do you guys do all these weird rituals and all this stuff? He goes, well, one, it's a way to focus the mind, and the other thing we do it for is it really pisses off the Christians, and we like to do that. It's a lot of fun for us. But he wrote the Satanic Bible. He wrote a bunch of other works, which are really quite interesting. And he's the guy who first talked about psychic vampires. psychic vampires. Now, there are people who believe themselves to be psychic vampires. I might have some video later who do this consciously, where they'll come to you consciously and they'll ask, they can even ask, do it consensually, if they can take some of your energy, and they'll sit there and drain your energy. And some people claim they can feel their energy being drained. Other people say it's just, fantasy. But that's the second type. Third type, blood-drinking vampires who are generally mortal, who need to consume blood in order to stave off a number of unpleasant side effects. These are also sometimes referred to as vampiroid, or vampire-like creatures. And you find these in literature, and you'll find these also in real life, people who have this belief about themselves. And in literature, these are sort of people who are on the way to becoming vampires. So in the Dracula movie, or in the Dracula story, this would be Renfield, who he goes crazy, he gets back to England, he goes crazy, and he sits in the cell, and he catches rats, and he drinks their blood, and little bugs and stuff, but he's not really quite a vampire yet. He hasn't really become full-on vampire. He's sort of on the way, right? And then you also have people who believe they need to consume blood. Okay, otherwise, bad things are going to happen to them. Now, for the so-called true vampires, these are more like the Anne Rice sort of versions. These are spiritual beings that don't have any physical substance, and this would include demons and gods that have vampiristic characteristics. There's a lot of these from all around the world. An example would be the Qiangxi in China, a Lilith, a Kali in India, and Lamia from Greece. Okay? There's a lot of these things. And if you read the Anne Rice books, all the sort of corporeal vampires are descended from these sort of spiritual beings. Okay? That these spiritual beings have entered into, given some substance of their spiritual substance to these human corpses, and these people then now reanimate and act like vampires. But the true ones are spiritual beings. And then we have the literary vampires, and these are characters from vampire stories, which may or may not be based on historical figures. And again, there's lots of these from different parts of the world. Okay? Now, lots of vampire myths. We can talk about some of these. Lilith is really good. You guys know about Lilith because we have Lilith Fair, right? It's the rock concert, right? That's, all the women artists. And you go down there and everybody's pro-Lilith. Well, who is Lilith? The myth of Lilith is very ancient and supposedly goes back to Sumerian and Babylonian times, but was then perhaps then brought into Christianity, or actually not Christianity, but into Judaism. And I can quote you from this book, The Hebrew Myths by Robert Graves and Raphael Patai. God then formed Lilith, the first woman, just as he had formed Adam. So Lilith is actually the first attempt to make a woman before we have Eve, right? So before God makes Eve as a partner for Adam, he makes Lilith. Okay. So God formed Lilith, the first woman, just as he formed Adam, except that he used filth and sediment instead of pure dust. So already this idea that women are, somehow more debased than men. Adam and Lilith never found peace together, for when he wished to lie with her, she took offense at the recumbent posture he demanded. Why must I lie beneath you, she asks. I was also made from dust, and I am therefore your equal. Because Adam tried to compel her obedience by force, Lilith in a rage uttered the magic name of God, rose into the air, and left him. So you might get a sense of why she might be an inspiration to women nowadays, right? It's like, no, I'm equal to a man. I should be able to do, I don't have to be submissive to you, sexually or any other way, right? I'm your equal, right? So Lilith has now become sort of the patron saint of feminist women who believe that they, I think quite rightly, are equal to men. And so again, that's why you have Lilith Fair, and all these kind of things going on, and paying homage to Lilith. That, in the sort of patriarchal male society, religious society, she's looked down on as this evil creature, but in reality, she's just a woman who wants her independence and who wants her equality with men. Now, she's often depicted this way, with these sort of feet like this, sort of these, I guess they're bird feet and wings. And she's often shown with owls. So owls are her patron animal.
Why is that? Why the owl?
I don't know. I'm guessing probably because the owl is seen as a creature that was probably in places like Egypt was somewhat sacred. Also, the animal is known to see very clearly at night. It's a night predator. So again, it's this nighttime thing. The owls come out at night. And then Lilith is also thought to be this sort of night creature, right? Night creature. Because what happens is that she becomes a demon. And she takes on vampiristic qualities, and she's seen as the progenitor of sort of a demon-type vampire. So again, if you go to Anne Rice, you'll see she's one of these spiritual progenitors of all the sort of other vampires. Okay?
So was she essentially punished for wanting to be equal to men?
Yes. Well, this is the patriarchal religion punishes her and demonizes her because she wants to be equal to men. This is why women now are trying to rehabilitate her as a role model, right? She's extremely powerful and difficult to kill. She has magical demonic abilities, which include raining fire, plagues, etc. And she can turn into an owl. Her name is derived from the sound that the owl makes. Okay, there you go. She's often depicted as half female, half snake or reptile, and in some stories, the snake in the Garden of Eden is actually Lilith. You know, basically telling you, yeah, you don't have to listen to this patriarchal order. You know, go ahead and eat the apple. You can be wise too. Right, or telling Adam, go ahead and eat the apple. You don't have to listen to what these authority figures are telling you. Okay. That's it. All right. Now, next kind of vampire we'll talk about. So Lilith vampire is one of these ones that's inspiration that comes from one of these early myths. Other inspiration for vampires came from actual real people. And supposedly there's a guy named Vlad Dracula Tepes. Dracula means, I think it means dragon. And supposedly he was around in 1476 and he became a vampire, and he's supposedly the first of the sort of new lineage of sort of human vampires. Okay. Supposedly he spent time with the Lilith vampires, but he sort of forms his own vampires, and a lot of other vampires come from him. And again, these are vampires that, like you see typically in the movies, do not like holy objects, holy water, crosses, things like that can hurt them and deter them. And we're going to talk more about Vlad Tepes in a minute. We'll talk about the actual historical figure in a minute. But supposedly these kinds of vampires also have sort of a dark magic, and they can ride on moonbeams, turn into mist, change forms, becoming a wolf or a bat. They are very conquest-oriented, and they scheme to gain what they desire. We might say they're a little sociopathic. They're like wolves hunting prey, plotting to strike and enjoying their victory. The older they get, the more pronounced their desire for conquest becomes. And again, these are vampires based on this historical character. We'll talk about him in a minute. Here's another one. You wouldn't think actually vampires come from the British Isles, but we have this one. It's actually pronounced Bavanshi. This is where our word banshee comes from. And this is a type of vampire in Scottish, and I also think in Irish mythology as well. And they are known as the White Woman of the Scottish Highlands, usually found in forests or natural settings. A banshee has the form of a beautiful woman in a green dress. One version says they have deer hoofs for feet, which they keep hidden under the dress. They will appear together as groups, and then often will have them seducing young men with their beauty, inviting men to dance with them, and then eventually attacking the men and drinking their blood. So this is going to be another pattern you're going to see of these sort of powerful female creatures who then lure young men into, with their sexuality, and then drain them of blood or drain them of energy. And there's lots of versions of this. I have some other ones later I'll show you. But we have a lot of versions of these kinds of vampires in Asia, right? So in China and Japan, you have these fox demons, for instance. And they do sort of the same thing. So if they don't drain the men of blood, they drain the men of their how shall we say this in a nice way, reproductive fluid, over and over and over and over and over again until the men just sort of dry up and are spent and die, right? And some people say, what a way to go, but obviously in the myth, there's a real danger from this sort of thing, right? Yes?
Isn't this like the same thing as kind of mermaids?
some mermaids, like sirens, but they don't typically drink the blood.
They don't
Right.
drink the blood,
But they cause the ruin of the men. And so there's lots of myths around the world about these powerful female figures who lure, seduce men to their death, right? And again, some people have thought that this is expressing the fear that men have of women's sexuality, that women's sexuality, women's reproductive cycle, these kind of things that men both fear and also possibly envy women for this. So there's actually been some very interesting psychoanalytic papers written about womb envy that men have, and some of the psychoanalytic theorists think that men become envious of women because when they're little children they realize that these women have the reproductive power, that they can have babies and they can't. And this is what motivates these men then to sort of denigrate women. And so when you see guys who put women down, and say bad things about them or label them bad, and I won't mention Bill O'Reilly and my friend Wendy Walsh, who have been in the news lately, but I just mentioned them. This is due to womb envy, according to these analytic theorists, right? This is what happens. Why men have to put women down, pay them less money, sexually harass them, all those things, because they actually envy their ability to have babies. Okay, so it's a very interesting little twist, feminist psychoanalytic twist on this old idea, which was penis envy, that women envy men because they had a penis and they realized they didn't when they were little girls, and so they had to get something in sort of compensation. This is why women wear lots of jewelry and makeup and stuff. That's the older psychoanalytic idea. But the newer one is this idea about this womb envy, which I think it actually really makes a lot of sense to me. Very interesting. And so some of these myths can be seen in sort of in the light of the idea of womb envy, that men are fearful and jealous of women's sexuality and reproductive power, so they have to put women down to sort of compensate for that. Now, here's another one from ancient Egypt, Sekhmet. Humans beings conspired to overthrow Ra and the other gods, and even the priests and magicians plotted against the gods. Ra hears of this, calls together all the other gods and says, "We got to do something about this." Let's have Sekhmet take care of this, because she is the force against which no other force avails, and will stomp out the rebellion, and she'll punish all those who had evil in their hearts and minds. So Sekhmet goes out and slaughters the humans and drinks their blood. Soon the land was so bloody and so many were dead that Ra and the other gods feared that no humans would remain on the earth. So something had to be done to stop Sekhmet. She was intoxicated with human blood and craved even more. Ra sent for a brew to be made from beer, blood, and certain plants, probably containing belladonna and opium, in order to calm and stop Sekhmet, right? Pharmacological anger management. 7,000 huge jugs of brew were prepared, and this bloody-looking liquid was poured over the ground in the place where she was to go. She came to this place, she thought she saw blood, and drank it all up. Then it is said that her heart was filled with joy, and her rage and slaughter was ended. After that, Ra praised Sekhmet in order to soothe her, calling her the one who comes in peace, beautiful, charming, and graceful. Yikes. And that's a picture of her. Lamia, from ancient Greece, was the daughter of Poseidon, who was the sea god, and a woman named Libya. She was the queen of what we now call Libya, right? The country Libya, who was, and Libya was Zeus, also Zeus's lover. No, sorry, she was the daughter of Poseidon and Libya, and became Zeus's lover. That means she became the lover of her uncle, which was not unusual back in these stories. Hera, who was Zeus's wife, became very jealous and turned her into a monster and murdered their children. Or the other part of the story is Hera killed her children, and the grief turned Libya into this monster. And this monster was called Lamia, and it was cursed with the inability to close her eyes, so she'd always see her dead children. Because of this, Zeus gave her the gift to be able to take her eyes out to rest and put them back in again. As a monster, Lamia was envious of other mothers and ate their children. She had the body of a servant and breasts and head of a woman. She's occasionally depicted as a female, but also shows up in male or hermaphroditic form. The myth of Lamia turns up in Bulgaria, goes from Greece to Bulgaria, where she is a mysterious creature with several heads. Like the Hydra, the heads can grow again if cut. The Bulgarian Lamia feeds on people's blood, and more typically by killing young women. She often tortures villagers and is to be found in caves or the underground. Okay, and this is likely the origin of referring to blood-drinking female vampire spirits as Lamia. So again, this one is similar to when we talked about the evil eye myth. You know, the idea that, you know, this is a way you explain child mortality, right? Well, the baby died. Why did the baby die? Well, Lamia must have come in the night and, you know, and got to the baby somehow. Now, we also have vampire tales in ancient India, and we have blood-drinking creatures, even like gods like Shiva, often depicted holding a blood-filled goblet in the form of a human skull while standing in a pool of blood. Kali, his consort, is depicted dancing on or copulating with Shiva's naked corpse. She wears a necklace of severed heads and sometimes has cut off her own head. And I think I showed you guys that picture of Kali cut off her head and the blood is coming out, feeding the servants. Did I show you guys that? Mm-hmm. So, again, so you see an element of vampirism here. And again, shameless plug, if you're interested in these Indian kind of things from the East, take my Psych 344 class in the fall, and I'll go into some of these things in more detail. Also, the Rakshas were described in ancient India Vedas as demonic creatures, and they're sometimes depicted as vampires. The Rakshas are very famous in the Indian epic of the Mahabharata, whereby the avatar of Vishnu, which is, I'm blanking out on things today. Not Shiva, avatar Vishnu. Anyway, the avatar Vishnu is Vishnu become human, and he's married to his wife, and then Ram. So it's called, no, sorry, not the Mahabharata, the Ramayana. Sorry, I got the name wrong. The Ramayana is the story about Rama and Sita. Rama is an avatar of Vishnu. He's basically Vishnu born as a human being. And he marries Sita. Sita is spirited away by these Rakshasa. They steal her away, they kidnap her, take her down to Sri Lanka where they live. And the story is, the Ramayana story is about Rama having to go and find Sita, and with the help of his friends, Garuda, the vulture god, and of course Hanuman, the monkey god, they go down to Sri Lanka and they do battle with the Rakshasas. And while they're doing battle, Hanuman, the monkey, because he's very tricky, sneaks in behind into Sri Lanka and spirits Sita away and unkidnaps her. And so that's a very famous story. And again, the Rakshasas are a big part of that story. There's also a monster in ancient India which supposedly hangs from a tree upside down like a bat. It's devoid of its own blood. It's called the Baital. It has no blood of its own, so it has to get blood from other creatures. Other mythical vampire figures from India called the Bhuta. This is the soul of a man who dies an untimely death. It wanders around animating dead bodies at night and attacking the living like a ghoul. Again, sort of half zombie. Also, a Brahma Purusha, a vampire-like creature with heads encircled with intestines and a skull filled with blood from which it drank. In China, you have the Qiangxi or Qiangxi. In Chinese belief, each person has two souls, a superior rational soul and an inferior or irrational soul. The superior soul could leave the sleeping body and appear as the body's double as it roamed about. It could also possess and speak through the body of another. However, if something would happen to the disembodied soul during its journey, the body would suffer. The inferior soul, which is called the Pai or the Po, was what inhabited the body of the fetus during pregnancy and often lingered in the bodies of the dead. It was thought to preserve the corpse. If the Pai was strong enough, it could preserve and inhabit the corpse for a length of time, using the body to serve its needs. The body animated by this inferior soul was called the Qiangxi or Qiangxi. Qiangxi were created after particularly violent deaths, such as suicide, hanging, drowning, or smothering. It could also be the result of an improper burial, as it was thought that the dead would become restless if their burial was postponed after their death. The Qiangxi were not known to rise from the grave, so the transformation had to take place prior to the burial. It was nocturnal and had difficulty crossing running water. It was said that that these Qiangxi were particularly vicious and ripped the heads or limbs off their victim. They're also said to have a strong sexual drive, which led them to attack and rape women. And again, this sexual drive aspect of vampires really also, you find this in the West. You see this in Bram Stoker's Dracula, for instance, that the vampire has very strong magnetic, seductive power over women. After a period of growing stronger, Qiangxi would gain the ability to fly, grow long white hair, and possibly change into a wolf. People protected themselves by Qiangxi by using garlic or salt. So again, here we have garlic in China as something that wards off vampires, and something you also find in Europe as well. They're also driven away by loud noises. It was thought that thunder could kill them. Brooms were used to sweep the creature back to its resting spot, while iron filings, rice, and red peas were used as barriers. If a Qiangxi reached its flying, white-haired stage, it could only be killed by a bullet or by thunder. Its body must then be cremated. And one of my favorite, possibly partly vampiric creatures, is called the kappa. These are kami. These are spirits that you find in Japan, and again, they come from the Shinto belief system. And they're also found in Japanese mythology, sometimes called yokai, kappa or yokai. They're typically found near rivers. When caught, the kappa will emit an extremely violent fart. Okay? They have 3 ani, okay? And it will fart from these things as a deterrent. They're described as the size of a small child, usually depicted as being both like a reptile, a turtle shell, with its webbed feet and the head of unkept hair, as well as being somewhat human. They have a bald spot with an indentation in the middle of their head that holds or absorbs water. This gives the kappa incredible strength and magical power. When the head of the kappa becomes dry, it becomes weak and must return to the water very quickly. In pre-modern Japan, kappa were blamed for children and livestock drowning, rape, and all sorts of unpleasant things. Don't go near the river, kids. The kappa will get you, right? This is what they use them for, like kind of a bogeyman. Also, according to legend, a cucumber is delicious to the kappa and its favorite food. That's why when you go to the sushi restaurant and you order cucumber sushi, it's called kappa maki. Right? Kappa maki, right? Sushi restaurant, because kappas like this food. Here's a picture of the kappa here. Now, the kappa is sort of a vampire. What it will do is, if it finds you and you're in the water, the kappa rises up from the depths, inserts its beak into your anus, and sucks out your intestines as if they were soba noodles. So it's kind of a weird sort of vampire. What's happened, interesting enough, I find this fascinating, so it's a little bit of a side, but I include this in there, that these horrifying kami that you have in Japan, these creatures that were in the woods that were really bogeymen, you know, they were like these monsters used to scare children, you know, don't go swimming in the river, you know, because you might drown. That's what the parent would say, and the kid's like, I know how to swim, right? So the parent wouldn't say that. So the parent would say, don't go in the river because the kappa will get you. It'll stick its beak up your butt and suck out your intestines and, you know, scare the kids, right? So what's happened in Japan is these creatures become, over time, especially in modern times, they become what the Japanese call kawaii. You know, this word kawaii means cute. So they've undergone a cuteness transformation. And so what you see in Japan now is like, this is the original depiction, this horrific kappa, right? But now you see road signs where the cute kawaii kappa is telling you, oh, only 7.8 kilometers to go, right? So this is a little depiction cartoon. He's friendly now, right? But he's got the indentation on the head, he's turtle-like. So he's been cutified, right? And even Hello Kitty, Maneki Neko, you know this Hello Kitty, right? That's the kappa's friend now. So again, this is like, there's a cuteness thing going on, which is really interesting because it happened to a lot of other Japanese creatures, but the kappa is a really interesting one. Here's another version of the kappa you may know. You may know who this is? Gamera. Yeah. Extra points for you. This is Gamera, who was the turtle monster who originally fights Godzilla, but in the later like Godzilla monster movies, Gamera becomes a good guy. Right? He transforms into a good guy. Even Godzilla becomes a good guy later. But again, this is also probably related to the kappa, right? Gamera. All right, in Southeast Asia, places like Malaysia, they had a vampire called a pangolin, and this is also probably very similar to that Hindu Indian vampire, because it again has a human head with entrails around the body. It searches for human blood, especially from babies and small children, which may be related to child mortality. It survives by drinking its victim's blood. And here's some wonderful dolls you can get of this. You can buy a pangolin doll, right? And again, vampires from all over the place. Ghana, Asabonsam, okay? And it comes in male, female, and child version, iron teeth. dangle their feet down from trees into victims, suck the blood from thumbs of sleeping people. Japan, the cop I mentioned. Mexico, I don't know how to pronounce this one, Chihuahua, stillborn baby or mother who died in childbirth, which attacks and paralyzes babies. Okay. Brazil, the Jaracaca, it's a vampire in the form of a snake. It's said to steal mother's milk while she's feeding from her child. You know that mother's milk, of course, in the female body is transformed from blood. So there's a connection between breast milk and blood, right? That breast milk is created in the body from blood. And so sometimes breast milk takes the place of blood. Also from Brazil, the lobisomem, a vampire that preys mostly on women, doesn't actually kill its victims, but draws small amounts of blood. After its attack, the woman begins to display nymphomaniacal tendencies. So again, here's the sexual stuff, right? That you get attacked by the vampire, seduced by the vampire, you become a nympho, right? So that's another thing, the sexual stuff. So remember I told you about sex and aggression being ambivalent, that they a lot of times come together? Well, the vampire is a very good example of this. And then these nymphomaniac women then go and drain the energy from men through excessive lovemaking. Okay, so again, very similar to the Asian myths. So let's talk a little bit about medical conditions related to vampires. And this may be have something to do with where some of these vampire stories and myths came from. Okay. So there's two conditions, first called porphyria and the second called xeroderma pigmentosum, that renders the sufferers sensitive to sunlight. In addition, porphyria causes the skin to tighten around the teeth and the gums, which makes the incisors appear more prominent. And porphyria patients are also sensitive to garlic. So it's, one of the thought is that maybe people who had this disease, they would only come out at night, they had sort of looked like they had fangs, and they were sensitive to garlic, that some of these vampire myths may have been from encounters with people with these diseases. Now, other conditions as well, like catalepsy, cause the nervous system to effectively shut down the body, slowing the heart rate and breathing till they're barely observable. And so this might have, you might have, back in the old days before they had modern technology, they might have thought somebody died. They could have buried them, and then the person could have come out of it and then, come back to life, so to speak, and people would have thought that that person died and then come back to life. Also could be related to vampire myths. Also severe anemia, which includes symptoms such as paleness, inability to eat solid food. Also, it's kind of similar to what we see in images of vampires and those people who've been attacked by vampires. So again, it could be anemia going on here. And if you lose a lot of blood, you'll become anemic as well. Here's somebody with porphyria, and they go out in the sun, and what happens is the sun burns them very severely, and so they get all scarred up. This could be seen as kind of somebody monstrous. Now, here's a portrait of Mad King George. He was the king around the time of the American Revolution, and now thought perhaps that he was suffering from illness like porphyria, which has to do with a rare genetic abnormality, and it causes various disorders, including mental disturbances. So people with this porphyria also would be, kind of impulsive and make, kind of irrational decisions and, kind of mentally ill and disturbed. And again, this is also something we might, associate with, some monstrous-like creature like a vampire. Now, we get to actual historical figures who supposedly were vampiristic or who inspired vampires. This is Vlad Tepes Dracula, also known as Vlad the Impaler. You may have heard of him. He was around in the 1400s. This was his castle, and actually recently came up for sale a couple years ago. It's gone, not too bad. A video about impaling. And Vlad, I had some information on him. So he was in the 1400s. He lived in a kingdom that was, I want to say, blanking on this now. It was like in Bulgaria, in Eastern Europe. And what they did a lot of times, the Ottoman Turks would come in and invade these places. And Vlad was the king of one of these one of these places that the Turks like to invade, and so he fought the Ottomans all the time. He's fighting the Turks all the time. Okay, so off and on fighting them, having wars with them. He was supposedly a very, very good warrior, and he would capture prisoners and things, but he liked to torture people. So he'd capture prisoners, and then what he would do is he would have a stake in the ground, and what he would do is he would put people on these stakes, like impale them on the stakes, right? And then what happens is you slowly slide down this thing, and you're on the stake, and then you know, great agony, and you die very slowly. And supposedly he would set up his picnic table there, and out in this field of impaled victims, mostly Turks, he would there have his breakfast and enjoy the sights while eating his food. Right? So he would just,
sociopath, right?
yeah, he had a lot of characteristics of a psychopath, a sociopath, and a sadist. Right? He very much enjoyed other people's suffering. There was a case where the Turkish ambassador came to his court. This is during one of these times of peace, supposedly, came to his court, and the Turks back in those days wore these big turbans, and Vlad said something like, well, you're in the presence of the king, you should take your hat off. And the guy's like, well, we can't, these are turbans, you know. And Vlad then said, well, if you really want to wear your hat, I'll make sure it stays on your head. And he had them forced down, and he had a guy bring a hammer and a big nail, and he just nailed the thing to the guy's head, through his skull. Right? So this is the kind of guy he was. Very interesting guy. Let's see, I think there's been a couple documentaries made on him. Here you go, here's one. This is an hour and 30 minutes. This is, I think there's a film. So there's a whole film of him. I want to say, I'm trying to remember the country where he was from. I'm blanking today. Sorry, you guys. But anyway, there's a lot of stories. This is a movie that was made. And in this movie, by the way, because it was made in Eastern Europe, they depict him as actually a good guy. Again, it depends where you park. If you didn't like the Turks, then he's actually a good guy. The Turks did a lot of bad things, right? They came and stole little kids away and turned them into slaves and mercenaries and eunuchs and all sorts of stuff. And so he's actually, Vlad is actually considered to be a pretty good guy. But he did do some bad things. And one of those, this guy's very nervous pouring his wine here. And I don't know if there's a scene in here of the, I don't have the impaling scene. Anyway, you can go in here and you can find all sorts of stuff about him. And there's there's another one here. This is a documentary. If you want to read about him. Very brutal, etc., etc., etc. Anyway. It's bugging me, though, where he's from, and I forgot. Somebody looked that up on YouTube. Brains, I need another cup of coffee. Oops. Another historical vampire was a woman named Elizabeth Bathory. And by the way, this is a picture from a film. What's that?
Romania.
Romania. Ah, duh. Romania, right? And Romania, of course, is near where? Eastern Europe, places like what? Transylvania, right? So Eastern Europe in the Western mind is seen as a sort of hotbed of vampirism because Vlad was from roughly near that area, right? So you sit in England and go, hey, Romania, Transylvania, it's all kind of in the same place, So again, but the Romanians, again, were fighting off these, the Turks invaded all the way into Europe, right? They were getting close to Europe before they were fought off. And so again, that was where that was from. So Romania, right? Thank you. Elizabeth Bathory is another person. This is actually a still from a film that was made about her, like a silent film. And it's very interesting for a number of reasons, but this is, you can notice the nudity here because this was pre-Hays Code, right? Hays Code where they sort of started rating movies and forbidding nudity and things like this. But before that, you could find these old movies and they had naked people and stuff in them. So this is a film about her. She also lived a while ago. This is supposedly a portrait of her, a very beautiful woman. And again, there's been some films done of her as well. And what she liked to do, she was a very beautiful woman, and she would hire servants from the surrounding countryside, and these servants would come to her house, and then one day servant did something and cut themselves, and she slapped the servant or whatever and got some blood on her, and then she thought, oh, this blood, it's preserving my skin. And she got the idea that if she bathed in blood, she could stay young and beautiful. Okay? And again, there's a really good movie about her, and of course in the movie, you know, she has to stay young and beautiful because her lover is this young guy, and she's worried that she's going to become unattractive to him because she's older than him, and so she starts down the slippery slope of first just getting some blood and wiping it on her, and then she realized, no, she's got to drain these servants of blood and fill up a bathtub, and the servants start dying, right? And she takes a bath in the blood, and in order to preserve her beauty. And what happens is, of course, the word sort of gets out that, you know, you don't really want to work at the castle if you're a beautiful young woman because, you know, bad things happen. Women go in there and they never come back. And so she actually has to start going out in the villages and sort of kidnapping women. And then, of course, what happens is some people get away and they realize it's her, and she ends up getting caught. And so they end up putting her on trial, but they can't execute her because she's nobility. So what they do instead is they put her in a room in the castle, and then they brick her into the room. They build her, they put her in a room, and they create a brick wall. They brick her into the room and keep her in there with just a little hole that they can stick some food through. And she is left in this room until she dies. So that's the story of her. But she's inspired a lot of myths and legends and a lot of Gothic people to be inspired by her thing. And so again, you'll see, like, this is actually a thing. You could go to one of these Gothic stores and buy this little figurine of her taking a bath in blood with the severed heads of her servants, you know, serving as candle holders. So people still really into her a little bit. Yes?
Isn't the, like, Iron Maiden named after, or, like, she created it or something like that?
Yeah, that's one of the myths. Actually, I think that's probably not really true, because I think the Iron Maiden was also used in other places. But yes, that was also true, that she would put the women in this, you know what an Iron Maiden is? It's like a big casket that's got spikes in it, and they put you in it, and then they would close the door, and the spikes would go through you, and then the blood would drain out, and then she would bathe in the blood. And now, yeah, that's right, yeah. Because she's one of the mythical creators of the Iron Maiden.
All right.
We use that. Let's talk some more about vampires. Let's talk about people who believe they're vampires. So we've talked about the mythical stuff, we talked about the animal kingdom, we've talked about some historical vampires. Now we'll get into the psychology, because we're going to talk about people who think they're vampires. And there's lots of different categories out there of people who think they're vampires. Here are some of them. Not a exhaustive list, but mythical vampires, people who think that they're directly descended from, you know, whoever, Lilith or whatever. Psychotic vampires, people who are psychotic and have delusional beliefs in vampirism. Human living vampires. Talked about these guys. These are ones who, we'll talk about them. Psychic vampires. Sanguinarians, people who feel they need to drink blood. Blood fetishists, so there could also be, like, you know, the playing around with blood to get a sexual charge out of it. Vampire gamers, so you play some vampire hunting game, and you know, that's your identity. Vampire hunters, people who want to go out and hunt vampires because they watch too many episodes of Twilight. Vampires, vampiric community. Medical vampires, people like to play with needles and drawing blood with syringes, all sorts of different things. There's tons of these things, right? So like this guy, you know, like he sleeps in a coffin. So into vampires, he, you know, builds himself a nice coffin bed and he sleeps in it. You know, there's all sorts of stuff out there. Vampire lifestyle. So again, these can be people who just, they don't really believe in vampires and drinking blood or anything like this, but they believe, they like the lifestyle. They think it's cool and sexy, and they like all these vampire movies and stories, and they like how people dress. And so they adopt a vampire lifestyle. And they might even have their teeth, you know, fixed to be vampire-like, but they don't actually believe in real vampires. They just like this stuff. So these are probably the most normal of these people, right? And again, you know, I had a student a few years ago who was really identified with being goth, and he had this whole thing. He told me, like, how these guys really aren't the same as goths, and yeah, but there's a lot of overlap between sort of goth people and these guys, you know, like. So you can be goth but not necessarily be into vampires, right? Or you can be goth and be into vampires and this kind of stuff. It just depends. And of course, this also has to do with fashion trends and romantic trends. And so I can show you some couple a couple, I think I have a video here to show you here. We'll see if this is still up.
Jet at Vampire Freaks in New York City. In this clip, we're going to talk about what are the different types of Gothic. Now here, there's the traditional Renaissance Goth, which kind of wears stuff that's kind of old Victorian style, kind of like these two items of clothing. As you see, this is kind of more almost like a cape flowing coat right here. And velvet and lace are very popular for the more traditional Victorian Renaissance style of goth. And there's also the fetish goth, which is very much about wearing vinyl and latex and things shiny, such as this coat right here. Fetish goth is more about kind of like the more like kind of the sexual aspect of it, and it's very just you know, they have different fetishes such as bondage and sadomasochism and whatnot. There's also the cyber goth. Here we have a pair of cyberdog pants. They'll be like reflective. Here we have circuit board on here with the padding on here. And the cyber goths also will wear the goggles such as these. You wear them on your forehead or over your eyes. So the cyber goth fashion also will wear neon colors, and it's very popular in the club scene also. Also, we have the industrial goth, or the rivet head, which is more about wearing kind of like metal plating, metal hardware, such as these pants. You see we have the metal hardware right here, these pants by SDL. And here, this would be also kind of an industrial rivet head vest right here. The rivet head goth is kind of more aggressive. In this clip, we'll talk about how to dress goth. Here, this is Jet and Sue here at Vampire Freaks, and dressing goth is mostly about wearing all black, and we like to wear kind of different materials than you would normally wear. So just here we have a nice fuzzy coat, and she's wearing a nice frilly skirt. You can wear like, I'm wearing a vinyl coat. You can wear like vinyl, velvet, latex, different materials as opposed to just a regular everyday cotton that normal people would wear. And it's very much about accessorizing. You know, you wear the goggles or a nice collar or bracelets, and just like little things here and there really add to your ensemble. Now, dressing goth can be a little bit costly, especially if you're just starting to become goth, since you're going to have to throw out all your non-gothy clothes and get all new clothes. But, you know, you can kind of do it yourself also, and maybe dye some of your clothes black, maybe cut up some of your clothes and safety pin them together and make them look cool. But you can also shop around online, and you can find some pretty good deals online, and it doesn't always have to be that expensive, but you know, some of the cooler things are expensive, and sometimes, you know, fashion has a price, and it's worth it, I think, also. Once again, this has been Jet and Sue here at Vampire Freaks.
There's a study done recently about Gothic lifestyle people, and they found that actually Goths made very, very good parents. And they found the other thing is that that even when they get older and they got married and had kids and everything, they were not only good parents, but they kept up having an interest in like really creative things like music. Like a lot of them were really into music, like stayed really interested in music, and they actually ended up being very satisfied people and very satisfied family members. So again, you know, just to point out that, you know, we shouldn't judge a book by its cover, right? And so again, there's this overlap between the Gothic stuff and the vampire stuff, and again, you can see it in those clips. All right, let's talk about human living vampires and sanguinarians and psychic vampires. So human living vampires are live human beings, not dead, not resurrected people, but they're people who believe that they either need to or desire to actually ingest blood, the sanguinarians, or to take and siphon off psychic energy off other people. So these are the two subsets of human living vampires. And so, of course, you know, this stuff, around Halloween, you know, the TV industry always needs more stuff. And so, of course, they always do something about vampires around Halloween. And of course, you guys know Tyra Banks, who's the fashion model turned, TV star. She had I don't know if it's still on or not, but she had like an Oprah-like show. And so she did one where she talked about vampires. And so I'd show you a little clip of this.
Is this crazy new HBO series about vampires called True Blood. I know y'all have heard of True Blood, right? Oh, yeah. And they've got this like off the hook insane ad campaign. Check out these posters that they have for the show. It's like top model vampire, yeah. And they're smiling with their fangs. Okay, everybody's obsessed with that book series Twilight. You guys heard about Twilight? It's this book series. Wow, yeah. It's about an ordinary teen girl who is madly in love with a vampire boy. And there's even a big movie coming out in November, a Twilight movie. So some people totally believe that vampires are real, but I've got to say, I'm not so sure. And that's why we're doing a special Tyra Show vampire investigation. So let's meet a man known as the Vampire King, Don. Come on out, Don. Come sit next to you, but I'm nervous. Me too. Oh my God, I'm gonna hug a vampire. Ah! Oh my God, he has the teeth too. Sit down. He's got the teeth too. Okay, does anybody notice like how I'm dressed today? It's like, I'm like, child, I am nervous up in here.
Same here.
Oh, you're nervous too?
Of course, you have a live studio audience.
And you're nervous? Like, you have these fangs that can dig into my throat right now.
Yeah, but usually I'm quite the hermit when I'm at home. So.
Oh, you're a hermit?
Yeah, quite a bit. Usually, I heard the Vampire King thing. Those who are in my circle usually call me the Emperor. But at the same time, I usually try to keep myself away from the regular energies of society and things like that.
The regular energies.
So that way I can focus on my studies.
Okay, so we're regular.
Well, I wouldn't say regular.
Like we're not vampires.
Correct.
When you're a little boy and your teeth fell out, did those teeth come in? Like how my molars came in? Let's see them. Did those come out like that?
No, they're all filed out.
They're filed out. But did they grow that long, or did you add something to
added,
it?
Yes.
There's a little bit added. Okay. So, gosh, I'm looking at you on the monitor. Put them on the face. Wow, you look scary. You look like that movie Vampire Lestat. Doesn't he? Yeah. Like, and sometimes, like when people try to be vampires, they put like all the makeup on and stuff.
Correct.
You don't even
I wanted
have
to make sure that I reflected things in the correct atmosphere.
But you don't even have the makeup on and stuff. You just
no.
have the face like a vampire.
Natural.
Okay. So sorry. Okay, let me get back to this. So vampires are real?
Yes, we are a real community that exists. The practice has been around for quite a long time. I should lead in to say that you have the Hollywood movies and things like that that actually cast a certain negative stereotype. We are, some of us actually have a religious faith, I guess you'd say.
What's yours?
I'm an eclectic. An eclectic would be someone who would...
I thought he was going to say, I'm a Pentecostal.
Well, if you were to... if you were to define an eclectic, it would be a person who would study up on all the different main religions of the world to be able to get a higher perspective or understanding, I guess you say, of the higher being, that we all are connected to.
And there's 3 different types of vampires.
Yes, there is.
Tell me about the first type.
The first kind would be considered a blood feeder. The definition would be called a sanguinarian. And the sanguinarian, as they feed on the blood is a rudimentary means of being able to transform the life force energy, per se.
So tell me, what's the second type?
The second kind would be the psychic vampire, what we call Psy for short. And that would be a person who has pretty much gone away from the blood. Blood these days is considered a taboo subject, you know what I mean? And it's blood,
It's just blood.
But at the same time, it's a transference of the life force energy without touching someone or just by laying of the hands and such.
Okay, and then the third type is the hybrid, which means both.
Yes.
Which type are you?
I am a hybrid.
You're a hybrid.
Correct.
So you drink people's blood?
Correct. Actually, let me expound upon that. It wouldn't be anybody who would, of course anybody can catch, certain things like HIV and any other types of diseases and such. I wouldn't want to be feeding off of someone who, per se, has any type of psychotropic drugs inside of them and such,
Psychotropic, what does that mean? Break it down.
Well, you'd have Vicodins.
Heroin.
Heroin,
crack.
whatever. Definitely wouldn't, just as you wouldn't either or whatever.
Just like I wouldn't either. Just like I wouldn't bite somebody's neck that had some drugs in them.
Tyra.
Okay. I know you're nervous. You're not nervous now, right? You didn't know it was going to be fun. You thought I was going to attack you. No. I'm not going to attack you. You're going to attack me. Okay. So how do you get the blood from people?
Okay. The blood is pulled from the vein, of course, with a lancet.
What's a lancet again?
Lancet. Some people in the audience might be familiar with it, especially if they've given blood, usually hooked up to
like a needle, like a
needle, lancet.
Okay.
And it's usually within the main veins and such. And pretty much we'd connect it over to an area, a receptacle or something like that. And
like
usually
a glass.
I would just need
and you put the
like
blood into a glass. Okay, we're going to check out how Don feeds blood from humans.
For Henry, drinking blood is on one level a part of his identity as a man.
I'll let you guys watch the rest of it, but it's there on YouTube, you can see it. But it gives you an example, and he does another example where he sucks people's energy and, like a psychic vampire. That guy is on a lot of, anytime they have vampire stuff on TV, he's kind of one of the go-to guys. I think he's on the database of all sorts of producers. Anytime they want a vampire, they have his number and they call him up, and he likes the attention. What do you think psychologically is going on with that guy? Anybody have any psychological diagnosis or insights? What might be happening with him?
I mean, he's not exactly normal.
Well, how is he not normal, other than the blood drinking?
He doesn't like to be out with energy per se.
Yeah.
So he's very to himself, isolated.
Yeah. He's in his own little group, people. Yeah. That's not necessarily bad.
No, but it's not considered always normal.
Yeah. All right, well, just keep that in mind. Yes?
He might be looking for a group that he can kind of connect with.
Yeah.
He either doesn't have friends or never really has a family kind of background. Not always, but it's oftentimes people who kind of join groups like these or
Yeah.
They might have already had some interest, but they also have disconnects with no friends or no family.
Yeah, so they don't have a lot of strong connections with family or friends, and so they're looking for a community to join and be part of. So this is like gang guys do this, right? This is one of the motivations people join gangs, right? That could be with this guy, yeah. But he likes to go on TV. He likes to get attention. Okay, so I want you to be thinking about that. Yes?
He likes to get his energy from other people.
Yep.
It's kind of narcissistic.
Yep. So there's an element of narcissism here, right? That he's getting, he's sucking energy from other people. He needs to have the adoration of other people. He needs to take in energy from others. That's definitely a very narcissistic trait. So
people call him the king or emperor.
being very important, grandiose, yes, yeah. So keep those all in mind. Those are all very good thoughts. Let's talk a little bit about psychiatric diagnoses for vampirism. Traits common in personality disorders and among vampires. Self-centeredness manifests through a me-first, self-preoccupied attitude, a lack of individual accountability that results in a victim mentality and blaming others in society and the universe for their problems, lack of perspective-taking and empathy. And again, these are all things you see, definitely you see these in literary vampires, right? And I think you see these in people who are like Dawn, who think of themselves as vampires. Manipulative, exploited behavior, vulnerability to other mental disorders, depression, anxiety, panic attacks, substance abuse, and obsessive compulsive disorder. Distorted or superficial understanding of self or others' perceptions, being unable to see his or her objectionable, unacceptable, disagreeable, or self-destructive behaviors or the issues that may have contributed to the personality disorder. Socially maladaptive, changing the rules of the game, introducing new variables, otherwise influencing the external world to conform to their own needs. And then again, no overt hallucinations, delusions, or thought disorders. Okay? And so again, if you think of like a vampire character, you think about you know, like an Anne Rice vampire, or you think about other vampires you see in the movie, they have a lot of these kinds of things. Right? A lot of these kind of things. So in the DSM-5, there's a definition for sexual sadism. And again, this is one of the things that we sort of typically think of when we think about vampires. Sexual sadism denotes fantasies, urges, behaviors that involve real acts, not simulation, in which the suffering of another person is found to be sexually exciting. So if the idea of drawing blood, you know, injuring somebody and drawing blood, if you find this to be sexually exciting, then, you know, sexual sadism can be a diagnosis for vampirism. Also, the idea that, you know, at least in some of the vampire movies, that the vampires are seducing people, they're manipulating people, they're hurting people psychologically in order to get what they want. That would also, to some degree, fall under sexual sadism. Now, the diagnostic criterion is that there needs to be recurrent, intensely sexual arousing fantasies, urges, or behaviors involving real acts in which the psychological or physical suffering of a victim is sexually exciting to the person. These fantasies, urges, or behaviors must have a duration of at least 6 months, and they must cause significant distress or functional impairment. If these don't bother your life, they don't impact your life in a negative way and the people around you, then it's not really a disorder. So again, a lot of people can have aspects of sexual sadism, but actually not be diagnosed as sexual sadists, because the distress and impairment is really key here. And this is important because we don't over-pathologize people, right? If people are, you know, Don lives in his community and he's with people who, maybe he's with a bunch of people who are masochists and he's a little sadistic, everybody's getting along and having a good time, it's not really a mental disorder per se. Right? Yes?
Can people who tend to have, think they're vampires also be kind of diagnosed with antisocial disorder?
Maybe, yeah, because remember personality disorder, there's a lot of overlap between everything.
Okay.
Okay? So definitely that could be the case. Let's see, anything else new here? Okay. People with sexual sadism often only come to be known by psychologists and doctors because they get in trouble with the legal system. Otherwise, you know, they're happy going around hurting other people and getting their jollies, but they do something that's illegal and they get arrested, and then they come to the attention of a psychologist. Yeah? Some people with sexual sadism just may have the intense fantasies and may not actually act out on those things. Okay? And usually the fantasy is also about having complete control over the victim. And the victim is terrified of what's going to happen to them, but it doesn't necessarily happen to them. And again, this is something you also see in vampire literature, right? When Dracula comes for you, comes in your bedroom window at night, and you wake up and you see him, and he looks in your eyes and paralyzes you before he drinks your blood, and you're terrified, right? You see this typical thing in vampire movies. So this control of the victim is a big deal. And we also find this control over victims, you know, in other sexually sadistic acts, like some of the people, like, for instance, like those women we talked about who had Stockholm syndrome, you know, who are abused by these guys. You know, a lot of time they are completely, you know, helpless, like the woman with the box in her head, right? You know, kept under the bed. She's completely controlled, right? So sexual sadists, sometimes the most extreme ones, especially, this idea of control is really, really important to them. And again, other people may, you know, be very masochistic and consent to whatever sadistic thing that the sexual sadist is trying to do to them. They may actually enjoy that. Again, it comes to the attention of the legal system when we have non-consenting people involved, right? You don't want to be bitten, you don't want to have your blood taken, but somebody grabs you and bites you, that's when you call the cops. Okay? They come to arrest the guy, he says he has all these fantasies, and he gets referred to a psychologist. Now, Freudian view of vampirism, as you might expect, it's related to the Oedipal complex, and some people think that this is a very interesting father-daughter Oedipal fantasy, incest fantasy. The hostility, the rage, and the aggression that you would see is something that's probably a pre-Oedipal issue. This is probably more like something you get from somebody who's personality disordered. They have a lot of rage, and you know, they've internalized a lot of the bad aspects of the parenting, and so they've got a lot of rage and stuff inside. But then they enter into the Oedipal phase, and then the rage gets acted out in the Oedipal complex. And so a lot of times, you'll see in vampire literature this way. It's an immature female without autonomy submitting to the father's demand for control over her life. Right? So this is kind of a feminist viewpoint. That you have a young woman who's trying to be independent, and the father is the one who's controlling her. And by controlling her, he's basically sucking the life out of her. Right? I'm sure none of you guys ever felt that way about your fathers. But, that your parent is there, hovering over you, paralyzing you, can't do anything, and by doing that, they're sucking the life out of you psychologically. So that's one way to look at this. And again, the Oedipal issue here is that you are having, you might want to get rid of the one parent in order to possess the other parent. And so again, that's also playing out, but with this underlying rage involved, a lot of this rage and anger. And of course, the other one that we already mentioned is narcissism, which is an inflated self-conception, need for attention, adoration, emotionally superficial person, and the vampire is a way of getting attention. And the interesting thing is, like, a lot of the vampire stories and myths have something about mirrors. What does the vampire see when they look in the mirror? Nothing. The mirror is blank, right? And so again, this can be a desperate need for the infusion of emotional nutrients, symbolized by blood, that coexist with the revulsion of their own neediness. And this results in a narcissistic rage and envy toward the good, resulting in its destruction, leaving only the bad. And the mirror plays into this because the idea here is that, like, at least for psychoanalysts, it's like the narcissist has this self image that constantly has to be pumped up, that constantly needs, attention, adoration from other people, needs energy from other people. And if they don't get that, then it withers and dies. And so the idea is when they look in the mirror, they don't see themselves because they don't really have a true self. Their self is really this narcissistic self that doesn't, and the true stable self doesn't exist, and that's symbolized by the blankness in the mirror. Now, again, like the narcissist, these people constantly need adoration. They constantly need energy from other people. So again, the vampire is a very good metaphor for the narcissist in this way, right? Because the vampire also, they drink some blood, but what happens is that only lasts a little bit of time, and eventually the hunger comes, and they've got to go back out and get more blood. And this is similar to the narcissist. The narcissist gets some adoration, that sustains them for a while, but then that wears off, and they've got to go out and get more adoration, more attention from people. Okay? That attention they get from people can be negative or positive. You can be famous or you can be infamous, and you can still get that stuff. And so if you, again, have this sort of narcissistic rage and envy rolling in you, and the attention you're getting, the adoration you're getting is negative, that also can sustain you. And so again, this is also where you see the narcissist and the vampire sort of coalescing to some degree. Now, we can look at from the point of Carl Jung. I like Jung and Freud, so I talk about Jung and Freud in my classes. And again, because we see these images of vampires almost any place we find human beings, we can think of the vampire as kind of like an archetype. And the vampire can represent the archetype of the shadow. And the shadow is the repressed wishes, the antisocial impulses, morally questionable behavior, grandiose wishes for power, other shameful aspects, and other aspects that we all have that we tend to repress, or we tend to keep out of consciousness. Okay? And the shadow figure then can, if those things are not allowed into consciousness, but we have those energy, that urging coming to us, especially from Jung's collective unconscious, then what happens is that those aspects can take on autonomous form. And they can be projected out into things. And for Jungians, this is where we get our vampire image. This is shadow projection. Okay? These traits should be dead in us. They shouldn't be in us. They should be dead, but they somehow take on life and live on. They come back to life because we're not dealing with them. And there's narcissistic, psychotic, and autoerotic traits as well represented in the shadow. The shadow could be mixed in with other things, but for Jungians, this is a big deal. And if you go into Jungian therapy, a lot of times in Jungian therapy, you'll do a lot with your shadow stuff. This is the stuff that we tend to really keep very far from our consciousness. You really keep it at bay, and because we do that, it can take on a life of its own. And again, this is also probably why we have these shadow projections, why we see so many vampire kinds of things projected out into popular culture. Because again, that can be a repository for our shadow projections. Right? I don't have to deal with my vampiristic traits, me being like vampire, I can just project out and go see a movie about it. Right? We just project those out in order to preserve the good that's inside of us. All right. Questions about vampires. We could talk a lot more. I mean, if we had more time, we could really get into more about vampires, but I think I'll give you some basic psychology stuff there. And we can think of vampires essentially, you know, somewhat like narcissists. You can think of them a little bit as sociopathic, psychopathic, or antisocial personality disorder. And again, there's a lot of overlap between these things. Okay? And you see this in these patterns in people who have a lot of, in those things. So narcissism, psychopathy, and sexual sadism. So I see the vampire as some sort of mixture of those, the characteristics of those things. And again, you also see this, you know, in very negative figures, you know, historical figures who do really negative things, not necessarily sucking blood of people, but doing sort of sadistic acts to people. And you know, I'm teaching the other class on Nazi Germany. I just finished a lecture, was it last week, on Dr. Mengele, you know, who was the angel of death at Auschwitz. He was the guy responsible for putting all sorts of people to death, and also, you know, conducting all sorts of horrible medical experiments, painful, horrible medical experiments on people. And he would fit in this pattern, even though he wasn't necessarily sucking blood out of people, but he had sexual sadism, he had a lot of narcissism, he had a lot of psychopathy things, and then, you know, he acts out on this sort of narcissistic rage, you know, by doing these horrible things to people, doesn't feel remorse for it. You know, again, we don't know for sure whether he's getting sexual jollies out of it, but, you know, I think it's a distinct possibility. So again, you know, you see characters like this, maybe not necessarily overt vampires, but people who have these characteristics out there in society. Hopefully not currently, but I'm sure there's some out there. All right. I want to move on now and talk about werewolves. Talk about lycanthropy, which is it's werewolfism. And this is a quote from a play called The Duchess of Malfi by John Webster. I believe this was a contemporary of Shakespeare. This is what it says: "In those that are possessed with their overflow of such melancholy humor, they imagine themselves to be transformed into wolves, steal forth to churchyards in the dead of the night, and dig dead bodies up. As 2 nights since, one met the Duke, about midnight in the lake behind St. Mark's Church, with the leg of a man upon his shoulders, and he howled fearfully. Said he was a wolf, only the difference was a wolf's skin was hairy on the outside, his on the inside." Very interesting. So this comes from way back when, and people were thinking about werewolves, and again, in this conception, the wolf is the man is on the inside. So it's not what you look like on the outside, but it's how you feel on the inside. Very interesting, very psychologically astute. And again, the idea that this person is melancholy, so this is related to depression, right? And a lot of times, you know, we think about depression as anger turned inward. You don't express your anger, you just turn inward towards yourself. And so again, we can see this relationship between depression and werewolfism, right? That, you know, you turn the anger in on yourself, and this turns you into a beast, right? And then you do all sorts of things like eat dead bodies and stuff. Now, werewolf sightings. Werewolves are really interesting. I should mention here that wolves have a very interesting relationship to the human psychology. That for much of human existence as a species, we've had to deal with wolves as a very significant danger. And you imagine, you know, being a primitive hominid living in Europe, maybe a hunter-gatherer, and you have very primitive weapons. You have the use of fire, but you're living out in the woods. It's cold. You know, you have a lot of protection, and you have to deal with packs of wolves. And so again, you know, there's a lot of history about wolf-human interactions, where, you know, wolves would, you know, attack and eat people, and people would then, you know, retaliate and kill wolves, and wolves were really a constant danger going on. So wolves have woven themselves into our psychology, right? Wolves are also highly related to dogs. I mean, genetically almost indistinguishable from dogs. However, dogs are a domesticated version of wolves, and that domestication has changed dogs' behavior to some degree to be a little bit more fitting into the human dominance hierarchy and a little bit more part of human society, as wolves tend to be much more independent things. Anybody ever met a wolf hybrid dog or interacted with a wolf? They're very different than like a regular dog, right? And almost more cat-like. They're very independent. And like a dog, you can train a dog to do whatever you want, and it'll do it, because it wants food. A wolf, you essentially make suggestions that it might want to do something versus something else, right? And you can bond with wolves. I mean, they'll bond, they'll fit into the human dominance hierarchy, but they don't make a good pet because they're really very independent. And because of this, you don't know how they can be very unpredictable, right? And so again, this is why they often, like the dog breeders and people, it's really discourage, wolf hybrids. And I think in a lot of places they're illegal. You can't have them. And so again, there are important behavioral differences. Wolves exist in dominance hierarchies and packs. The hierarchies are very well worked out. Again, there's similarity to primate dominance hierarchies. This is why dogs can fit in so well with humans and why they were able to be domesticated. Wolves are very efficient hunters. They're very smart. They're very strategic. And they get a bad rap nowadays. When you see people hunting them from helicopters, it seems kind of sad. But again, you have to go back not too terribly long ago to when wolves were really a significant scourge on human beings. Okay? And so again, we have that sort of in our psyche, the sort of fear of wolves and the bestial nature of wolves. Now, that's wolves. The idea that people can change into animals is, again, a very, very long-held idea you find in many, many different places around the world. From Native Americans who might become shapeshifters to werewolves found in Europe and other kinds of people who can switch identities, take on, transform their bodies into animals. So this is something that you see a lot, in different human societies. Werewolves are very interesting because, of course, there's been all sorts of, back in Shakespeare's time, they were talking about werewolves and things like that. People who thought of themselves as a wolf or who felt that they were people who transformed into wolves. In America, very interestingly enough, the place you find the most werewolf sightings is in Wisconsin. I don't know why that is. I have some guesses. Wisconsin is there's not a dense population except in the cities. Most of the state is very rural. It's very wooded. It gets very cold in the winter. It's very isolated. And so I guess if you're going to find if you're going to turn into a wolf, that's a good place to do it because lots of places to run around. But there's a lot of werewolf sightings in Wisconsin. It's very interesting. I don't know quite what that has to do with anything, but I was reading about that. In the werewolf sighting, typically, you'll be driving down a road in the middle of the night. Something will jump in front of the headlights, and it'll look like a wolf, and it'll run off into the woods. And somebody else will see it, or somebody else will report being attacked by a wolf that walks on two legs. And again, this probably also relates to Bigfoot to some degree. Bigfoots tend to be a little more gentler. They don't seem to be quite so wolfish in the attacking people and trying to eat people and things like that. But also related, big hairy creatures that run around in the woods, but they're anthropomorphized. They're like human beings, but they're running around the woods. My brother-in-law is a TV producer, did a show about searching for Bigfoot, and they went up to some secret location in the Pacific Northwest where there's supposed to be Bigfoots, and they had all these kind of crazy people who were, contestants on the show who were running around the woods trying to find Bigfoot, and they come back with this evidence. And he actually did an interesting thing. He actually got a biologist who brought a portable DNA analyzing machine there out in the woods. And when they come back, I found a piece of Bigfoot feces. Okay, let's check it out. No, that's a bear. And so they're actually able to analyze stuff. And of course, as you might expect, they didn't find Bigfoot. Nobody claimed there was like $1 million prize if they found evidence of Bigfoot. Nobody claimed it, but those guys still believe there was a Bigfoot out there somewhere. Right. So these Bigfoot myths are very similar to the sort of werewolf myths. Of course, werewolf films. There's been very good films of werewolves. The ones that I remember, a kid starring Lon Chaney, who's a big guy, and of course, You know, the werewolf, we always memorized when we were kids, we memorized the werewolf saying, you know, even a man who's pure at heart and says his prayers at night can become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the moon is full and bright, right? That's what I remember from the movie, right? And so again, you get cursed with the werewolf thing. Maybe a werewolf bites you, you're cursed with the werewolf, and then what happens on the night of the full moon, you turn into a werewolf and you run around, you do all sorts of beastly, ghastly things, kill people, eat people, whatever it might be, and then you wake up the next morning, you don't have any recollection of it other than that you know that you turned into a wolf and done these bad things. You have sort of an amnesia, right? And so the werewolf guy is going to know he's going to be a werewolf. He begs to be locked up in the jail at night, don't let him out, and somebody inevitably lets him out, and he runs off and he does stuff. And it's very interesting because in the werewolf movies, a lot of times, the guy who turns into a werewolf is oftentimes very depressed. So again, I think there's a really interesting relationship to depression and werewolves. You should write a paper on that. That would actually be really interesting. I think there's an interesting, because you even see it in the movie. Like Lon Chaney's a kind of depressed character. He's running around, he's feeling bad, and then full moon comes along and he turns into a werewolf. And there's stuff that supposedly, you know, drives wolves away. I don't know, garlic and wolfsbane is a kind of a herb plant. And then, of course, you know, that you can only kill the werewolf with silver bullet. Silver is supposedly, you know, again, one of these alchemical metals that has a certain purity to it. So the idea that the werewolf is somehow impure, right? And he can only be killed by something that is pure. It only can be subdued by something that's pure. So again, there's an implication of moral failing here. So you turn into a werewolf, you got cursed because somehow you got a moral failing, right? You didn't live up to some sort of standards. Yes?
Have you seen, or do you say that the idea of the person turning into the werewolf, how you said that in that movie he's really depressed and stuff like that?
Yeah, he's sort of depicted that way.
It kind of changed to like someone who's more self-centered?
Yeah, everything's changed. Everything has changed in pop culture to more narcissism because we live in such an incredibly narcissistic era. I'm sorry to tell you, but I mean, you know, you don't really have to look too much farther than, you know, the political things going on now to see that narcissism is really predominant. So yes, any modern vampire or werewolf is going to be more narcissistic. This is why we have beautiful vampires now, right? Used to be vampires were horrific Nosferatu characters. Now they're beautiful and you want to kiss them, right? You know, I mean, this is you know, now a vampire looks in the mirror, they see a beautiful person, right? And you even see this in the depictions, and now you see vampires looking in mirrors and they can see themselves in mirrors, right? So there is a self there, but it's this narcissistic self is now being reflected. And before it was just like there was no real self. Now it's a narcissistic self. And I think the same thing for werewolves. Okay, so when you have what's the series of Twilight? The werewolves are fighting the vampires. And again, it's the same kind of thing, right? The same kind of thing. I don't know. You guys think the werewolves in that series were more depressed than the vampires? I'd be curious about that. I should do a poll. I would say maybe a little bit. They seem a little more depressed, right?
I would say the vampires are more self-hatred towards themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they have a little more. Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting study. So this is something somebody could study in graduate school. You know, I don't know. You have to find a place that will let you do this. But I do think there's some relationship there. I don't know. I'll talk to you about when we find people who believe themselves to be werewolves. We'll talk about the psychotic component in a minute, because that's what we see in people who believe themselves to be werewolves. Again, we have wolves really part of history. You know, again, interwoven into human history. This is a statue of Romulus and Remus, who were the founders of Rome. And supposedly the story was they were abandoned in the woods and they were found by a she-wolf who suckles them and raises them. And again, this is what makes Romans so tough, you know, because, you know, Rome, of course, conquered a big chunk of the world back away, and their founders, you know, they were, you know, raised by wolves, right? When we say raised by wolves, you don't mean that they're wild and crazy. You mean raised by wolves, they're, you know, strong, right? So that was the thing, raised by this wolf. Now, I'm talking about case reports of people who believe themselves to be werewolves. And in these cases, we tend to find people who believe themselves to be werewolves to be a little bit psychotic. Okay, so this is a case report. 49-year-old married woman presents on an urgent basis for psychiatric evaluation because she has delusions of being a wolf and feeling like an animal with claws. She suffers from extreme apprehension and feels that she's no longer in control of her own fate. She says, "A voice was coming out of me. Throughout her 20-year marriage, she experienced compulsive urges toward bestiality, lesbianism, and adultery. So again, as you might expect, a little sexual component to this as well. So this is what you find. A lot of case histories, you'll find delusions, psychotic delusions of these people. Now, we should talk about related things related to shape-shifting and werewolfism. And this is something called Otherkin. And in this class, we've talked about, for instance, people who are transgendered, who have a body dysphoria or gender dysphoria, who feel like their body is not the body of the gender that they are. They have a body of a woman, but they feel inside like they're really male. Or they have a body of a male, but they really feel inside like they're a woman. And they might go through a period of time, and they might actually, surgically alter their body, hormonally alter their body to match how they feel. We've also talked about people who feel like certain aspects of their body, like an arm or a leg, doesn't belong to them. Podominophilia, they've got to get rid of it, right? Well, Otherkin are similar to people who are transgendered or podominophilia, but what they feel is they feel that they're not the right species. In other words, they have species dysphoria. Okay? So it's not that I'm a man or a woman, it's that I'm not a human being. I'm in a human body, but I really feel like, in the inside, I'm a wolf, or I'm a tiger, or I'm a giraffe, or I'm an alien being, or I'm a fairy, or I'm some other kind of mythical creature. I'm a unicorn. Okay? Or it can be a regular animal. I'm a pony, or I'm a puppy. Okay? And again, this varies from people who like, for instance, to, in a BDSM thing, like I showed you that picture of the woman who liked to dress up like a pony and pulled the cart around, do so-called pony play. There's also something called puppy play, where people like to be a little dog and they get petted, to people who actually really feel and really strongly believe that they really are they're not in the right body for their species. Okay? Or maybe they're a human body, but their previous life they had been a dog, and they got bumped up, because of good karma, they got born as a human, right? But they really have a lot of dog characteristics still, right? So you find all sorts of beliefs around this, and these people will call themselves, many of them will call themselves, they call Otherkin. And Otherkin are really interesting because they are a sort of a sub-community, a community or a subgroup who basically were able to sort of coalesce because of the internet. Yet another group. That before the internet, these people were very, very isolated and would never talk to anybody who had the same beliefs as them. But once the internet comes around, especially in the early days, when they had listservs, which were not graphically based, that people would put out there, anybody else feel like, they are a wolf inside? Somebody say, yeah, I feel the same way, And then pretty soon people said, wow, there's 100 of us. Let's have a convention and all get together, right? And then they started having conventions. And then now you can go and you can find other conventions that huge numbers of people show up. And people are wolves, people are fairies, people are aliens, people believe that they're anime characters. And the degree, the degree of which they feel the sort of trans-species or species dysphoria varies. Okay? It's also complicated by the fact that some people may not really believe they're a wolf or just sort of think it a little bit. But what they really do is they like to dress up in a wolf outfit and then rub up against other people who are wearing furry outfits, and it becomes a sexual thing, right? And these people are called furries, right? It's a little subgroup within this. And again, if you go to one of these conventions, you'll find everything is mixed together. So somebody may be trans, maybe species dysphoria and furry. Somebody may just be furry, just a sexual thing to go and get in a suit and rub against somebody else. Remember we talked about frottage, right? That just turns somebody on, so they dress in the suit. Other people are not interested in the sex stuff. They just really feel like there's some other kind of creature. And so these Otherkin, everything is represented in this way. It's very interesting. And I think I have some video to play you.
Tails are wagging this weekend downtown in the David L. Lawrence Convention Center because they loved our city so much. The 11th annual Anthrocon Convention is back here in the Burg. The convention goers are pretty easy to, well, spot. So who are you?
Kohaku. I'm, like I said, from Toronto. Drove down 7 hours to get here.
And let's see your tail. Turn around. In fact, they've traveled here from around the world. Europe, Japan, Australia, across the U.S., and they'll be in Pittsburgh for 5 days. Almost 3,000 attended the 2006 Anthrocon convention, making it the largest in the world. This was their promotional video they posted on YouTube. Who are all these people dancing in animal costumes? They call themselves furries.
Technically more of a lifestyle. It's such a wide field of, like, there's no one word to describe what furry is.
While they do acknowledge that for some furries there's a sexual aspect, but most say the adult-themed furries aren't the majority.
Furry is a person who online pretends to be a humanoid animal, is the essentials of it, because, hey, it's fun. We're humans. We know what humans are like. Why not be something else?
Only about 10% of our people are costumes. Anthrocon is not just for people in costume. It's for artists, cartoonists, performers, puppeteers. We have people here who draw comics for a living. We have people here who do newspaper comic strips. We have people who are professional illustrators. We have professional sports mascots here.
Much of the Anthrocon convention is closed to the public, but today, our cameras were invited inside the Westin Convention Center Hotel, and I had a nice chat with these gentlemen from Germany.
No talking while in costume? Can I ask you this? Are you enjoying Pittsburgh? Has the convention center been great? What about the weather, though? It's a little hot, especially with all this, right?
But weather aside, not only do the furries love the Berg loves them back. Last year, they brought in more than $2.5 million.
They definitely did come in swarms, and I mean, we did see a hit in business, especially late night, like, because not only them coming in, but everybody else got excited when they saw them in the full gear, coming in, taking shots, having a good time. It was definitely fun.
Wait, could they do shots if
we have to give them straws.
Which means both the locals and our animal guests should have plenty of tales to tell after Anthrocon is gone. Kelly Fry, Channel 4 Action.
To give you some sense of it, again, you know, whether people are feeling trans-speciest or whether they're just into it for the fun, or again, there's a wide variety here, wide variety. Let's see what else, if I have anything else here on this.
World role plays every single day. We pretend to be something that we're not, but that we wish we were.
They say that furries never grow up.
When you have a young mind, you have imagination.
We never really grew out of the idea of animal people.
Children are allowed to use it.
When I was a kid, I was a mad scientist. I didn't have any friends, so I went home and made some. Mom always said to make friends.
I went through school as the odd person, as you know, the person with no friends.
Yes.
And I had to pretend to be, you know, into the race cars.
If I wasn't in the suit, I'd be considerably more shy. But when I put on the suit, I feel excited. I mean, it's a transformation. It's a rush. There's a high to it that can't be beat.
I guess adults shouldn't play like that. They should do their accounting and they should go to work and drive their cars and drink their coffee. But it's like, why? It's no fun.
The animals are our teachers. The animals are part of who we are. But in the society today, it's not taught, it's not practiced, it's not understood.
That's too fantastic. That can't happen. That's impossible. No, you can't do that. Blah, 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 blah. You can't. You can.
After a few hours of walking around her, I started to see the world entirely anew. I was reborn through the suit. This is a new world for me to explore, and it really makes me feel liberated.
When I came to my first furry convention, it was a feeling of coming home.
Yes.
I found the place I belong.
I've been to combat 3 times. I've been through an assault on Baghdad. I've been to Fallujah. I've been to Ramadi. I have on more than one occasion contemplating just ceasing to be. If I didn't have the support of this group of friends, I probably would not be here today.
Some people just want to have a little fun with the world.
Handsome lion, looking for a lioness to share long evenings with.
He loves you. He wants to mate.
Roar! I had pined and dreamed and wanted and yearned
for so long, for so many years, to have something like this, to have the costume.
In the bedroom, it lets the beast side of me come out much more open and free because it's my persona, it's not me, the person. I can be somebody completely different.
To anyone else, they look at it and go, it's just a piece of duct tape and fur and foam and stuff put together. To us,
it's quite a big
this is why Herb and I are together. I get to let out my primal side. That's furry love, it really is.
We always talk about the utopian society. Well, H.G. Wells, here we are.
Again, there's lots of stuff in it. The furry suits, you can have them custom as a company. They used to be up in Santa Cruz. They'll make you a suit. It's about $5,000, $6,000, something like that. So, I mean, people put a lot of money into this stuff. Okay. And again, you know, I mentioned, this slide's out of order. This should have been back in the thing, but these are the fox demons I talked about. So again, this idea of like people, you know, changing species, but the idea that it may be a demon that, you know, is able to shapeshift and take on the you know, they're actually a demon, but they take on a appearance of a human female and then seduce men and then, you know, basically, you know, take all their energy through lovemaking, right? So again, this is the Kitsuki, and it's Japanese for the state of being possessed by the fox demon. Now, again, we can talk about psychological diagnoses of lycanthropy, psychoses I mentioned. Another disease that's very interesting that's been linked to vampire folklore as well as werewolves is rabies. That people suffering from rabies avoid sunlight, they froth at the mouth. The froth could sometimes be red in color and resemble blood. And so again, we've had a very interesting history, you know, in human history with rabies. And rabies was something that was inevitably fatal disease. If you got bit by a rabid animal, you know, you would basically die. And you know, it's a disease, you get bit, but it takes, it's a long incubation time, takes a couple weeks, and you start showing symptoms. You might foam at the mouth, you become afraid of water, you become kind of crazy, you become very aggressive, and then, you know, that leads you to go bite somebody else, and the disease sort of perpetuates itself. But a lot of times, you know, the animals that would be rabid would be dogs. So, you know, it gets associated with dogs and then with wolves, and so this is something also seen like a werewolf curse. Okay. Now, the treatment for rabies, if you get bit by a rabid animal or you think you've gotten bit, what will happen is they will give you a shot for rabies, a big shot. I think they used to give it right in the belly. And if you get the shot within 2 weeks of being bitten or exposed to rabies, then you'll be cured. But if you don't, then you will, it used to be considered to be fatal. And now there's been a couple cases where they've taken somebody who's gotten rabies, and there was a woman up in, or a girl up in Minnesota or somewhere who got bit by a dead squirrel that was rabid. And she didn't realize it until a couple weeks had gone by, and then she started showing the symptoms. It was already too late for the vaccine. And what they did is they put her in a medically induced coma and kept her body alive while she went through, you know, while her body got rid of the rabies. And she actually supposedly survived the rabies for that. And apparently that's been something that's been tried a couple other places, a couple other times without success. And I think they did another case in India where they were able to keep somebody alive till the body was able to get rid of the rabies virus. So there might be some hope now that people can survive. But again, if you see a dead animal in the woods, like a squirrel or something, you know, don't pick it up because it could bite you. It could have an autonomous, you know, reflex and it could bite you, and you could end up getting rabies. By the way, that's also true for rattlesnakes too. By the way, don't pick up a dead rattlesnake because jaws can contract and you can get bitten. But rabies now is, you know, a little bit better. You know, we don't have as much of it anymore, and this is really good. This is a public health thing, right? When you have a dog, any dog owners here? When you get a dog, what do? You get shots for it, right? You get to give it a rabies vaccination so it won't get rabies. You can do a preventative shot. They don't do it for humans. I don't know if they can. They probably don't have one for human beings. It's like Lyme disease, right? You can get a shot for your dog for Lyme disease too. You know, but humans, they don't have a Lyme disease vaccine. And I've heard this is because of politics and money that they haven't developed a vaccine for humans, but don't quote me on that. And I don't know if there's a preventative vaccine for rabies, you know, but usually you get it after you get the thing. Third would be an idiosyncratic expression of a psychotic episode. Again, you know, something involving schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or maybe clinical depression. So again, I like to think there's some relationship to depression here. We talked about Jungian, Freudian approaches. These would be similar to the psychological descriptions of vampires, except I would think that the bestial part becomes a little more predominant. And I like to think the bestial part may be related to the anger turned inward. That you become a beast and you forget being a human being. You forget, you're overtaken by the shadow. You're overtaken by the bad stuff. If you're a vampire, and you do bad things, you kind of know what you're doing. But if you're a werewolf, when you become a werewolf, you don't really know. You have amnesia. And so again, I think of this as like, it's sort of like possession by the shadow, possession by the bad object. It takes you over, and you become bestial. Otherwise, the psychology is very similar. And then the feminist approach, this is one I really like. This makes a lot of sense to me. Lycanthropy is the creation of males who, again, are afraid of the power of female sexuality. And again, the vampires, or the werewolves, only turning bestial during the full moon is, related to, to women having periods once a month, right? So again, once a month, women become these powerful bestial creatures that men are afraid of, the powerful creatures. In a lot of traditional societies, women are banished from the village, when they're having their periods. They have special menstruation huts outside on the periphery of the village, and women go there while they have their periods. And again, feminists feel that this is because men are afraid of the power of female sexuality, or I would add in this idea of womb envy, that they are so envious of women's reproductive capabilities. So they segregate them out of society during that time of the month. And again, that could be similar, fits in a little bit with the werewolf myth. All right. That's all I have for you guys. A little early. Any questions on anything? Yes?
I think it's interesting that they said that it was like childish and like an imaginative kind of thing.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a little bit...
So again, I put that in there to really show you the spectrum. That there's a spectrum of people who just feel like this is an imaginative thing where I'm just going to dress up as something different. Like, I don't know if you go to the Renaissance Fair or you go to a rave or you do anything, like where you're just going to go and be creative, and this is just a creative outlet, right? Which I would put not as a pathological thing. To people who really feel like I'm in the wrong body. I'm convinced that I'm not a human being. I'm just in this human body, but really I'm a wolf. And then there's people who are psychotically have a delusion of being a wolf. So again, you have all these kind of things related to sort of, shape-shifting, werewolfism, these kind of things. So just to point out that not everything is pathological. And we have to be very careful as psychologists not to pathologize everything, especially when something is creative. We want people to be creative. It's good. Right? It's good to have creative, interesting people out there, right? Yeah, they might seem a little dorky to you or whatever, but no, they're having a good time. They found other people like them who have the same kind of beliefs because of the internet. Now they're all able to get together and have conventions and have fun. Most of them probably would not be diagnosable with a mental illness. And then you're going to have a few on the fringes who could have various things. Okay, so I really want to iterate that because, like everything in this class, not everything is pathological. Okay, but if you saw a furry person walking down the street, you go, oh, that person is something, odd. They must be mentally ill or something. But that's not the case.